They say every family holds its secrets, stories passed down in whispers or locked away in the attic, never meant to see the light of day. My story begins with a phone call, a message that would forever change the course of my life. An inheritance, the kind most people dream of. A house. A legacy. A piece of someone's history gifted to you with the turn of a key. But when I arrived to claim my uncle's forgotten estate, I quickly realized this was no dream. This was something else entirely. This house, it was different. Its presence hung heavy, not just in the air but in the way the walls seemed to close in on you. You could feel it. The kind of feeling you can't explain but know instinctively to trust. Before we step inside, let me ask you something. Have you ever felt watched? Not the casual glance of a passerby, but something deeper. The sense that no matter how alone you believe yourself to be, there's someone, or something, standing just out of reach, their eyes fixed on you. If you haven't, you may feel it before this story is over. When I opened that envelope, it felt like opening a door to a place I wasn't supposed to enter. My uncle's life had always been a mystery. He was a man of few words, fewer visitors, and even fewer explanations. I hadn't seen him in over a decade, but here I was, the sole heir to his life's work, or his life's secrets. This is my story. A story of what I found when I crossed the threshold of my uncle's house. A story that begins with an inheritance and ends, well, you'll have to see for yourself. But I'll tell you this, it's not just a house. It never was. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. What you're about to hear is unlike anything else. Stay with me, and let's open this door together. It started with a phone call, a moment so ordinary that I barely thought twice about it. I was sitting at my desk, going through my usual routine, when my phone buzzed. The voice on the other end was curt, almost clinical. They told me my uncle had passed away. His lawyer needed me to come in and sign some papers. That was it, just another piece of paperwork in a world filled with red tape. At least, that's how it seemed. I hadn't thought about my uncle in years. To me, he was a ghost of the past, someone I'd only met a handful of times when I was a kid. He lived alone, far from the rest of the family, and rarely reached out. No one ever explained why, but I got the sense that people avoided talking about him. I figured it was one of those family things, secrets that get buried so deep no one even remembers why. The lawyer didn't give much away over the phone, but when I arrived at the office, his tone shifted. He was professional, sure, but there was something else. A hesitation. Like he was about to hand me something he didn't fully understand himself. "Your uncle left you his estate," he said, sliding a folder across the desk. Inside were a few photographs, a set of documents, and a single key. I remember picking it up and feeling its weight, cold and heavy in my palm. The head of the key was ornate, almost Gothic, with a strange insignia engraved into the metal. I asked the lawyer if he knew anything about the house, but he just shook his head. "I've never been there," he said. "Not many people have." The house was in the middle of nowhere, miles away from any town or neighbors. According to the will, my uncle had left strict instructions that it wasn't to be sold. It was mine, and mine alone. That should have been a red flag, but at the time, I just thought about the logistics. A free house? Who wouldn't want that? I signed the papers without hesitation. The drive out there took most of the day. The roads grew narrower, twisting through dense woods that seemed to stretch endlessly on either side. By the time I reached the property, the sun was already sinking below the treetops, casting long, jagged shadows over the driveway. And there it was, the house. Calling it a house doesn't feel right. It wasn't a home, not in the way you'd imagine. It stood there like it had been waiting for me. The roof sagged slightly, the paint was peeling, and the windows, those windows, seemed darker than they should have been, even in the fading light. I remember standing there for a long time, key in hand, feeling this strange pull. Like it wanted me to come closer. I shook it off, chalking it up to nerves. After all, I'd just inherited a house. Who wouldn't feel a little on edge? I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was cold, colder than it should have been, and thick with the kind of stillness you only find in abandoned places. It smelled faintly of wood rot and something else I couldn't quite place. The first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet you get in the countryside. This was oppressive, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for me to do something. My footsteps echoed as I moved through the foyer, the sound bouncing off the empty walls. The furniture was still there, covered in dusty sheets. It looked as though someone had left in a hurry and never bothered to return. On the mantel above the fireplace, there was a row of old photographs. I didn't recognize most of the faces, but in the middle was a picture of my uncle. He was younger, smiling faintly, but his eyes looked tired. Like he was carrying something he couldn't put down. I spent the first night exploring, trying to get a feel for the place. The house was bigger than I'd expected, with more rooms than seemed necessary. There were locked doors I couldn't open, staircases that creaked under my weight, and hallways that felt longer than they should have been. I kept telling myself it was just an old house, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I found the study. The door was slightly ajar, and inside, the air felt different, heavier. The walls were lined with shelves, crammed with books that looked older than the house itself. On the desk, there was a single journal, its leather cover cracked and worn. I opened it to the first page and saw my uncle's handwriting, neat but hurried. The date at the top was from years ago, long before he died. The entries started off normal enough, lists, notes about repairs, the kind of mundane things you'd expect from someone living alone. But as I flipped through the pages, the tone changed. The writing grew erratic, almost frantic. He mentioned hearing noises at night, footsteps, whispers. He wrote about doors opening on their own and shadows moving where there shouldn't have been any. "It's watching me," one entry read. "I don't know what it wants, but it won't leave me alone." That was the moment I realized this wasn't just an old house. And my uncle, he hadn't just left it to me. He'd left me something else, something I wasn't ready to face. I closed the journal and left the study, telling myself I'd read more later. It was late, and after the long drive, I was exhausted. Sleep seemed like the only thing that made sense. But that night, sleep didn't come easily. I settled into one of the smaller bedrooms upstairs. It was the least imposing of the rooms, tucked away at the end of the hall. The mattress was stiff, the air cold despite the layers of blankets I'd brought. I tried to tell myself the chill was just because the house hadn't been lived in for so long. But even with my eyes closed, I felt watched. Not just from the room, but from the walls themselves. The night was quiet at first. No creaks, no groans, just the kind of silence you only find in old, forgotten places. And then, sometime after midnight, I heard it. A faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate. It sounded like it was coming from downstairs. My heart started pounding in my chest, but I told myself it was nothing, a tree branch against a window, maybe an animal on the roof. I lay there, trying to ignore it, but the sound didn't stop. It didn't grow louder, but it didn't fade either. It stayed there, steady, like it was waiting for me to acknowledge it. Eventually, I forced myself to get up and check. I crept down the stairs, my hand trailing along the banister to steady myself. The tapping was louder now, echoing faintly in the stillness of the house. It was coming from the kitchen. I flipped the light switch as I entered, but nothing happened. The bulb flickered once and went out. I fumbled for my phone, using its light to guide me, but the room was empty. Everything was where I'd left it, except for one thing. There, on the kitchen table, was the journal. The same journal I'd left on the desk in the study upstairs. It was open to a page I hadn't read before. The writing was frantic, the lines slanting downward as if my uncle had been in a hurry. The words weren't sentences this time, they were fragments. Descriptions. Warnings. Don't listen to it. Don't look at it. Never leave the doors unlocked. I slammed the journal shut and carried it back to the study, locking the door behind me. I told myself I'd imagined it, that I must have moved the journal earlier and forgotten. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. The next few days were quiet, or at least quieter than I expected. I spent most of my time unpacking, trying to clean up the layers of dust and cobwebs that clung to every surface. But no matter how much I cleaned, the house didn't feel empty. There were moments when I'd stop and listen, convinced I'd heard footsteps behind me or the faint creak of a door opening in another room. But every time I turned around, there was nothing. By the third night, I started noticing small things. Lights that I was sure I'd turned off would be on again when I walked into the room. Doors that I'd closed would be open just a crack. Once, I found the back door wide open, the air outside cold and sharp. I'd locked it before going to bed, at least, I thought I had. It wasn't just the house. I felt it when I left, too. A weight, like I was being followed. Even when I went into town to pick up supplies, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was just out of sight. I'd glance over my shoulder, expecting to see a shadow or a face, but there was never anything there. And then there was the smell. It started as something faint, like damp wood or old fabric. But by the end of the week, it had grown stronger. It wasn't constant, it would come and go, usually strongest at night. It reminded me of decay. Something rotting. I searched every inch of the house, convinced there was a dead animal somewhere, but I never found anything. The last straw came on the 7th night. I'd started sleeping with the lights on, but even that didn't help. I woke up sometime after midnight, the room freezing cold despite the heater running at full blast. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I saw it. The closet door was open. Just an inch, but it had been closed when I went to bed. I stared at it, heart racing, every instinct in my body telling me not to move. And then I heard it. A voice, soft, almost a whisper, coming from inside the closet. It wasn't speaking words, at least none that I could understand. It was more like humming. Low and steady, like a lullaby sung just for me. I didn't open the door. I didn't go near it. I grabbed my keys and ran out of the house, not stopping until I was sitting in my car with the engine running. I sat there for hours, staring at the house, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The windows stayed dark, the front door closed. It was just a house again, ordinary and still. But I knew better. I spent the rest of that night in the car, the heater running to keep the frost from creeping in. The house loomed in the distance, its shadow stretching out under the pale light of the moon. I couldn't bring myself to go back inside. Not after what I'd seen, or what I thought I'd seen. But as the first hints of dawn lit the sky, I knew I had to make a decision. I couldn't just leave. Not yet. When the sun finally rose, the house seemed different, smaller somehow. The fear that had gripped me during the night felt distant, almost foolish in the daylight. I convinced myself I had imagined it, the voice, the open closet door, the feeling that something had been watching me. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I'd let my nerves get the best of me. But there was a part of me that couldn't let it go. That day, I made up my mind to learn everything I could about the house. If I was going to live there, or even figure out what to do with it, I needed answers. And so, I started digging. The first place I looked was the journal. I had avoided reading more of it since that first night, but now, I had no choice. I spent hours at the desk, flipping through page after page of my uncle's frantic handwriting. The early entries were harmless enough, notes about repairs, reminders to pay bills, even lists of groceries. But as the pages went on, they became darker, stranger. He wrote about things he couldn't explain, doors locking and unlocking on their own, objects disappearing and reappearing in odd places, shadows that moved without a source. At first, he tried to dismiss it as his imagination, blaming the isolation or the stress of maintaining the house. But over time, the entries became more desperate. "It's not just in the house," he wrote in one entry. "It's in my head. I see it even when I close my eyes." One entry in particular caught my attention. It was dated 2 weeks before his death, and it was the last thing he wrote in the journal. The words were scrawled across the page, uneven and jagged, as though he'd written them in a hurry. It read, "There's something in the walls. I hear it at night. I think it's trying to get out." I didn't know what to make of it. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as the ramblings of a man who'd spent too much time alone. But another part of me, the part that had heard the voice, seen the closet door open, couldn't shake the feeling that he was telling the truth. And if he was, then what exactly had he left me? I decided to dig deeper, starting with the town records. It wasn't easy. Most of the records were old, scattered across dusty shelves in a small office that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. But after hours of searching, I found something. A single document that mentioned the house by name. It wasn't much, just a deed transfer from over a century ago. But the name of the previous owner caught my eye, Elizabeth Greaves. The name sounded familiar, though I couldn't place it at first. It wasn't until I asked one of the clerks that I learned why. Elizabeth Greaves had been a widow, living alone in the house after her husband's death. According to town records, she disappeared one winter night, leaving everything behind. No one ever saw her again. But that wasn't all. The clerk, an older man with a slow, deliberate way of speaking, mentioned something else, something that hadn't been in the records. He said that people in town had always believed the house was cursed. He didn't elaborate, but the way he looked at me, the way his voice dropped to a whisper, made it clear he believed it too. I couldn't stop thinking about her, about Elizabeth Greaves and what might have happened to her. That night, I returned to the house and searched every inch of it, looking for anything that might give me answers. It was during this search that I found the crawlspace. It was hidden beneath the floorboards in the study, a small hatch I hadn't noticed before. The wood was warped and splintered, but with enough effort, I managed to pry it open. The air that rushed out was cold and stale, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and something else I couldn't identify. I shone my flashlight down into the darkness, but it didn't reach far. All I could see was a narrow staircase, descending into the ground. I hesitated for a long time, standing there with the hatch open, staring down into the dark. Every instinct in my body told me to close it, to walk away and forget I'd ever found it. But I couldn't. I had to know. The staircase creaked under my weight as I descended, each step sending a shiver down my spine. The air grew colder with every step, and the smell, God, the smell, grew stronger. When I reached the bottom, I found myself in a small, dirt-floored room. The walls were lined with wooden beams, and in the center of the room was a single chair. On the chair was a bundle of old, yellowed cloth. And beneath the cloth, it was a photograph. A photograph of me. I don't know how it got there, or why it was so old. But it was me, standing in front of the house, wearing the same clothes I had on the day I arrived. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. And then I heard it. The sound of footsteps above me, slow and deliberate, moving through the house. Someone, or something, was there. And they knew I was too. For a few seconds, I didn't move. I couldn't. My body was frozen in place, my eyes locked on the staircase above me. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, each one creaking against the old wooden floor. Whoever, or whatever, was up there didn't seem in a hurry. They were taking their time, as if they wanted me to hear them. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I kept telling myself it had to be an animal, or maybe I'd left a window open and the wind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. I had felt it the moment I stepped into the house, the weight of something I couldn't explain, something that didn't want me there. I don't know how long I stood there, rooted to the dirt floor of that crawlspace, but eventually, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. It wasn't just quiet, it was the kind of silence that pressed against your ears, making you feel like you were completely alone, even when you weren't. I forced myself to move, climbing the stairs as quietly as I could. My flashlight shook in my hand, the beam flickering slightly as I reached the top. I stood there for a moment, listening, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no movement. Just the house, still and waiting. I closed the hatch and backed away, my mind racing with questions. Who was in the house? Had they been watching me the whole time? And why had they stopped? Part of me wanted to leave right then and there, to get in my car and drive as far away as I could. But another part of me, stubborn, maybe even foolish, needed to know what was going on. The rest of that night was a blur. I checked every room, every closet, every corner of the house, but I didn't find anything. No signs of forced entry, no muddy footprints, nothing. It was like the footsteps had never happened. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Over the next few days, the activity in the house escalated. It wasn't just the small things anymore, the lights flickering, the doors opening on their own. It was louder, more aggressive. At night, I would hear banging on the walls, like something was trying to get out. Objects would move when I wasn't looking, a chair pulled away from the table, a picture frame tilted just enough to catch my attention. One morning, I woke up to find all the cabinets in the kitchen open, their contents scattered across the floor. Plates, glasses, silverware, everything was everywhere, like someone had ransacked the place. I cleaned it up, trying to convince myself it had been an accident, maybe a shelf had collapsed in the night. But when it happened again the next day, I couldn't ignore it anymore. And then there were the whispers. They started faint, barely audible, like a breeze moving through the house. But as the days went on, they grew louder, clearer. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, accusing. It felt like the house was speaking to me, and it wasn't happy I was there. The worst night came about a week after I found the crawlspace. I had started sleeping in the living room, closer to the door in case I needed to leave in a hurry. That night, I woke up to the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor upstairs. It was slow, deliberate, the kind of sound that made my skin crawl. I grabbed the flashlight and crept up the stairs, every muscle in my body tense. The sound stopped as I reached the top, leaving the hallway in an eerie silence. I turned toward the master bedroom, the only room I hadn't checked yet, and felt my stomach drop. The door was open. I was certain I had closed it before going to bed. I stepped inside, the beam of my flashlight sweeping across the room. At first, I didn't see anything. But then I noticed the chair. It had been moved to the center of the room, facing the window. And on the seat was the journal, open to a page I didn't recognize. The writing was different this time, jagged and uneven, like it had been written in a rush. It wasn't my uncle's handwriting. It read, "It's in the walls. Don't let it out." I turned to leave, but as I did, I heard it again, the humming. It was coming from the corner of the room, low and steady, like someone was standing there, just out of sight. My flashlight flickered as I turned it toward the sound, but there was nothing there. Just an empty corner, dark and cold. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with all the lights on, the journal clutched in my hands, trying to make sense of what was happening. I couldn't explain it, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't want to. All I knew was that I had to get out of that house. But even as I made plans to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't let me go so easily. The next morning, I packed my bags and loaded them into the car. I didn't look back as I drove away, but I couldn't help feeling like the house was watching me, its dark windows following me as I disappeared down the road. I thought I was free. I thought I had escaped. But I was wrong. For a few days after I left the house, things were quiet. I stayed in a small motel about an hour away, trying to figure out what to do next. Part of me wanted to forget the whole thing, to let the house rot and fade into obscurity. But the memories wouldn't let me go. I couldn't stop thinking about the footsteps, the journal, the voice in the corner of the room. And then, on the third night, it started again. It was subtle at first. A faint knocking at the motel door, just as I was drifting off to sleep. I opened it, but no one was there. I told myself it was just my imagination, a leftover paranoia from my time in the house. But that didn't explain the scratches on the doorframe, 3 long, thin marks that hadn't been there before. The next morning, I found my car covered in muddy handprints. They were everywhere, on the windows, the hood, even the roof. I tried washing them off, but no matter how hard I scrubbed, they wouldn't fade. It was as if the mud had seeped into the paint itself, a permanent reminder that I couldn't outrun whatever was happening. By the time the sun set, I realized I couldn't stay at the motel. The air felt heavier, charged with something I couldn't name. I packed my things and started driving, not knowing where I was going, just trying to put as much distance as I could between me and the house. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't until I stopped for gas that I realized something was wrong. The station was empty, the lights flickering overhead. As I filled the tank, I caught a glimpse of something in the side mirror, just a shadow, darting past the edge of the light. I turned, but there was nothing there. Just the empty road stretching out into the darkness. When I got back in the car, the engine wouldn't start. The dashboard lights flickered, the radio crackling with static. I tried the key again, harder this time, and the engine roared to life. But as I pulled back onto the road, I heard it, the humming. Low, steady, and unmistakable, coming from the back seat. I didn't dare look. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, my foot pressing harder on the gas. The humming grew louder, filling the car, pressing against my ears. I turned the radio up, trying to drown it out, but it didn't help. It was inside my head now, vibrating through my skull like a tuning fork. And then it stopped. Just like that, the car fell silent, the radio cutting off mid-song. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but the back seat was empty. I wanted to believe it was over, that whatever had followed me from the house had finally let go. But I knew better. It wasn't finished with me yet. That night, I checked into another motel, further away this time. I didn't unpack. I didn't even turn on the lights. I just sat on the edge of the bed, waiting. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the door, but eventually, I heard it. A faint scratching, just like before. And then, the voice. It wasn't humming this time. It was speaking. Whispering, low and guttural, just on the other side of the door. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, mocking, almost playful. It wanted me to open the door. To let it in. I grabbed my phone and called the front desk, trying to keep my voice steady. The clerk answered on the second ring, sounding groggy. I told him someone was outside my room, but he just laughed. "You're the only guest tonight," he said. "There's no one else here." I hung up and turned toward the door. The scratching had stopped, but the air felt heavier, thicker, like something was pressing against it from the other side. I thought about opening it, just to prove to myself that no one was there. But before I could move, the lock clicked. The door swung open on its own, and I saw nothing. Just the empty parking lot, lit by a single flickering bulb. I didn't sleep that night. I packed my bags and left before the sun came up, driving aimlessly until I found myself back in front of the house. I don't know why I went back. Maybe I thought I could end it somehow, confront whatever was haunting me. Or maybe the house had called me back, pulling me toward it like a moth to a flame. The door was unlocked when I arrived, the air inside colder than ever. I stepped into the foyer, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The house was silent, but it didn't feel empty. I could feel it watching me, waiting. I followed the feeling to the study, where the hatch to the crawlspace was already open. I don't know what I expected to find down there. The chair was gone, the dirt floor undisturbed. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something carved into the wooden beam above the stairs. 4 words, scratched into the wood like a warning: "It's not the house." I don't remember how I got out. I just remember running, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I stumbled up the stairs and out the front door. By the time I reached my car, the sun was rising, casting the house in an eerie, golden light. It looked almost peaceful, like it had been waiting for me to leave. I left that day and never went back. I thought I could outrun it, leave it behind like a bad memory. But even now, I can still feel it. In the quiet moments, when the house is still and the world is dark, I hear it, the humming. And I know it's not over. After I left the house, I tried to rebuild my life. I moved to a new city, started a new job, cut ties with anyone who knew about my uncle or the inheritance. I thought I could leave it all behind, bury the memories like the house itself was buried in the woods. For a while, it worked. Or at least, I convinced myself it did. But the signs were still there, small at first. The faint smell of earth in the corners of my apartment, the sound of footsteps in the hallway when I was alone. I kept telling myself it was nothing, a trick of the mind, echoes of an experience I hadn't fully processed. But then, one night, I woke up and found the journal on my nightstand. I hadn't brought it with me. I was sure of that. I'd left it on the desk in the study before I fled the house. But there it was, the leather cover cracked and worn, the pages still filled with my uncle's frantic handwriting. I didn't open it. I couldn't. I shoved it into a box and locked it away in the closet, hoping that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. The humming came back a few nights later, faint at first, barely audible. It would start in the early hours of the morning, just as I was drifting off to sleep. It sounded like it was coming from inside the walls, vibrating through the plaster and wood. I tried to ignore it, to block it out with music or white noise, but it didn't help. The humming wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, pressing against my mind like a weight I couldn't shake. And then the dreams started. In every one, I was back at the house, standing in the foyer with the journal in my hands. The air was cold, the walls seemed to close in around me, and the humming was deafening, drowning out my thoughts. I would wake up drenched in sweat, the sound still ringing in my ears, my hands clutching at the sheets as if they were the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. It wasn't until I received the letter that I realized I couldn't outrun it. The envelope arrived one morning, plain and unmarked, the paper inside brittle and yellowed. The handwriting was familiar, my uncle's. The letter was short, just a few lines, but the words were enough to send a chill down my spine. "You can't escape it," he wrote. "It's not the house. It's you." I didn't understand what he meant at first. How could it be me? I hadn't done anything. I was just a bystander, someone who had stumbled into something I didn't ask for. But the more I thought about it, the more it started to make sense. The house wasn't just haunted, it was connected, tied to something deeper, something that had latched onto me the moment I walked through the door. I started researching, trying to find answers, but everything I found only raised more questions. The stories I uncovered were fragmented, scattered across old records and obscure forums. Tales of people who had lived in the house before me, who had experienced the same things, voices, shadows, the feeling of being watched. But none of them had survived. They had all disappeared, leaving behind only fragments of their lives, hints of their existence in dusty photographs and forgotten journals. And then there were the symbols. The same ones I had seen carved into the beams of the crawlspace, etched into the walls of the house. They weren't just random markings, they were part of something bigger, a ritual or a curse that had been placed on the house long before my uncle ever lived there. And now, it had found me. I realized I couldn't keep running. The house might have been the starting point, but it wasn't the source. Whatever was haunting me, it wasn't tied to a place, it was tied to me. And if I wanted to end it, I had to go back. I had to face it. So, I made a decision. I packed my things and drove back to the house, arriving just as the sun was setting. The air was cold, the woods surrounding the property silent and still. The house looked the same as it had the day I left, its windows dark, its walls sagging under the weight of years. But this time, I didn't feel fear. I felt resolve. I stepped inside, the door creaking loudly as it swung open. The air was heavy, the smell of earth and decay stronger than ever. I made my way to the study, where the hatch to the crawlspace was already open, the darkness below beckoning me. I climbed down the stairs, flashlight in hand, and for the first time, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a small, wooden box buried in the dirt. I dug it out, my hands trembling as I lifted the lid. Inside was a photograph, old and faded, of a group of people standing in front of the house. My uncle was among them, younger, his face serious. But what caught my attention was the figure standing at the edge of the group, a shadowy figure with no face, its outline blurred and indistinct. I didn't have time to process what I was seeing. The humming started again, louder this time, filling the small space with its vibrations. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air growing colder with every passing second. I felt it then, the presence, stronger than ever, pressing against me like a wave. I knew I couldn't stay. I had to end it. I took the photograph and the box and left the house, not stopping until I reached the edge of the woods. There, I set the box down and struck a match, the flame flickering against the wind. As the fire consumed the photograph, the humming grew louder, almost deafening, before suddenly cutting off. The silence that followed was complete, oppressive, like the world itself was holding its breath. I don't know if it's over. The house is still there, waiting, its dark windows staring out at the world like empty eyes. But for now, the humming is gone. And maybe, just maybe, I've finally escaped. After that night, I did everything I could to move on. I burned the photograph, buried the box, and left the house behind. I didn't tell anyone what happened, not the police, not the neighbors, not even my closest friends. How could I? What would I say? That the house my uncle left me was haunted by something I couldn't explain. That I'd been followed, tormented, chased by shadows and whispers. No one would believe me. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, life started to feel normal again. I moved to a new city, far away from the house and the woods. I got a new job, made new friends, even started sleeping through the night. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt safe. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The humming is gone, yes. The shadows, the whispers, the cold spots, all of it disappeared the night I burned the photograph. But the memories, those haven't left me. They linger at the edges of my mind, creeping in when I least expect them. Sometimes, when the world is quiet and the night is still, I think I can feel it. The weight of its presence, just out of reach. I've started to wonder if I'll ever be free of it. If any of us will. Maybe it wasn't just the house. Maybe it wasn't even me. Maybe it's something bigger, something that's always been there, watching, waiting, choosing its next victim. And maybe it's already chosen. I know what you're thinking. You're wondering if this could happen to you. You're wondering if the house, the presence, the curse, whatever you want to call it, could find you, too. And the truth is, I don't know. I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't seek it out. It found me. And if it found me, who's to say it won't find someone else? Maybe it's already started. A creak in the floorboards, a light that flickers when it shouldn't, a shadow that moves just out of the corner of your eye. Maybe you've already felt it, the sense that you're not alone, even when you should be. If you have, then I hope my story helps. I hope it's a warning. But there's something else I want you to take away from this. Something important. You can't run from it. You can't hide from it. If it finds you, you have to face it. And when you do, you'll know. You'll know because it will force you to confront the darkest parts of yourself, the parts you've buried, the parts you don't want to see. And when that moment comes, I hope you're ready. Because I wasn't. Not at first. But now. Now, I understand. The house wasn't just a place. It was a mirror, reflecting something back at me that I didn't want to face. And maybe that's why it chose me. Maybe that's why it let me go. Or maybe it's still waiting, biding its time until I let my guard down. I don't know. I don't have all the answers. But I do know this, it's not over. Not for me. Not for any of us. If you've made it this far, I want to thank you. Thank you for listening, for letting me share my story. And if you felt even the smallest hint of what I've described, I want you to know you're not alone. Whatever this thing is, it's real. And it's out there. But so are we. And together, maybe we can find a way to stop it. Before you go, I have one last favor to ask. If you want to hear more stories like this one, if you want to help uncover the truth about the things that lurk in the shadows, then make sure to subscribe to this channel. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. And if you've ever had an experience you can't explain, leave a comment below. I want to hear your story. Because maybe, just maybe, your story will help someone else. Maybe it will even help me. And maybe, it will help us finally understand what's out there. Until next time, stay safe. And don't ignore the signs. You never know what's waiting on the other side.